Even though the audience, the television audience for this convention thus far has not been particularly large by modern standards, one might expect that people will tune in tonight to hear from this new running mate for Donald Trump, who many people will have never heard of before this week. J.D. Vance is not a widely known public figure. He is best known for having written a well-received autobiography, which he started while he was at Yale Law School. Mr. Vance also served for 6 months in Iraq as a public affairs unit officer in the Marine Corps. Served in a public affairs unit in the Marine Corps. Yes, even the Marines do have public relations. They're great at it, in fact. But that is the type of unit, a public affairs unit, that he was in when he was in Iraq. After he did his law degree, again at Yale, he became a protege of a very right-wing billionaire who you might remember from the first Republican National Convention that nominated Donald Trump for president. He had a primetime speaking slot. It was one of the weirder speeches of the 2016 RNC. His name is Peter Thiel. He got J.D. Vance a job at a biotech company in San Francisco after J.D. Vance graduated from law school. Peter Thiel got him that job, literally. The company's CEO says explicitly that J.D. Vance was hired, quote, as a favor to Peter, meaning as a favor to Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel then got J.D. Vance a second job. He directed one of his venture capital companies that they, too, should hire J.D. Vance. See, this is why these guys are so against any kind of affirmative action, because clearly they got where they are in this life out of sheer merit, as represented by having your billionaire friend call people and tell them to hire you, even though they're not sure why they're supposed to be hiring you. After Mr. Vance washed out of the second job that Peter Thiel gave him, Mr. Vance then got another job at a different venture capital firm with another tech billionaire, with Steve Case, who founded AOL. How did that one work out? Mr. Case is on the record saying, quote, he wasn't really working very much. Nevertheless, Mr. Vance then was able to go and start another venture capital firm with, surprise, yet more help from Peter Thiel. Like Mr. Thiel, who has named his companies after things in the Lord of the Rings series of J.R.R. Tolkien books. Lord of the Rings is a sort of favorite cosmos for naming things and cultural references for a lot of far-right and alt-right figures, both in Europe and the United States. Peter Thiel names all these things after Tolkien figures and places, like his company Palantir, for example. Like his mentor, like Peter Thiel, who had given him all his jobs in the world, Mr. Vance also, when he founded his own venture capital firm with help from Peter Thiel, named it after a Lord of the Rings thing. He called it Narya, N-A-R-Y-A, which you can remember because it's Aryan, but you move the end to the front. Apparently that word has something to do with elves and rings from the Lord of the Rings series. I don't know. In his new firm, Mr. Vance made one notable investment in one Kentucky company. That Kentucky company went public and then promptly went bankrupt. So that's the career. Does that sound like the rocket fuel trajectory of a person on a fast track to be nominated as the vice presidential nominee of the Republican Party of the United States before he turns 40? No, it does not. Writing a memoir and otherwise being Peter Thiel's intern is not usually the way you get to be a vice presidential nominee. It's not usually the way you get to be a United States senator either. But it is the way you get to be a U.S. senator if you're J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance's campaign for the U.S. Senate was the first time he ever ran for anything. His campaign was substantially, emphasis on substantially, funded by Peter Thiel, who dumped $15 million into a super PAC that supported J.D. Vance's run for Senate. That super PAC then further effectively took over the operation of the campaign and ran most of it for Mr. Vance. And after Peter Thiel personally took J.D. Vance to meet Donald Trump, literally, Peter Thiel physically walked him into the meeting and presented him to Trump. That is how Vance got the Trump endorsement for that U.S. Senate seat, which is all you need to win a Republican primary for Ohio Senate in 2022. That's how he won the Republican primary. He then vastly underperformed other Ohio Republican candidates on the general election ballot in 2022, but he did win, which is how he got into the United States Senate a grand total of a year and a half ago. And that's how he got to be the vice presidential nominee of the Republican Party right now. as internships go, that's a really good internship. The choice of J.D. Vance to be Donald Trump's running mate is reportedly a decision that was only made at the very last minute, like the day before it was announced. You do not choose a person like Mr. Vance because you think you need help winning the election. When they chose J.D. Vance, they did not think they needed any help winning this next election. If you're trying to make up for some, soft spots, some weaknesses in the Republican Party's electoral prospects, you do not, for example, choose a vice presidential running mate who is on the record, on tape, taking this position.
I certainly would like abortion to be illegal nationally.
I certainly would like abortion to be illegal nationally. 2022 podcast interview first unearthed by CNN Today, in which J.D. Vance says, I certainly would like abortion to be illegal nationally. Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump, whatever you think about his politics and his political instincts, he's been very open about the fact that he sees the Republican Party's strong stance against abortion, particularly a strong stance for a national abortion ban, as an electoral loser. Even though Mr. Trump is the one who orchestrated the overturning of Roe versus Wade and therefore the Republican abortion bans all over the country, Trump has admitted that strongly restrictive stances on abortion, particularly a nationally restrictive stance on abortion, will cost the Republicans elections they could otherwise win. So then why do you pick J.D. Vance to be your running mate? If you are Donald Trump and you pick a running mate and you're looking to pick a running mate to help your electoral prospects because you're worried about your chances of winning the election, you would never pick Mr. I would certainly like abortion to be illegal nationally. You would never pick a national abortion ban guy. Right? You would also not pick a guy who says we're in a, quote, late Republican period in this country. And he doesn't mean capital R Republican. He means small r Republican, meaning we are at the end of being a republic. J.D. Vance quoting there a far-right internet personality and blogger who famously advocates openly for the United States to become a monarchy or an outright dictatorship, who has called for abolishing the U.S. government, the U.S. system of government being abolished so we can instead be ruled by a Caesar figure. That is who J.D. Vance has been citing when he talks about us being in a late Republican period as a country. That's what he thinks about where we are as a country and where we should go as a country. You do not pick a man like that if you are worried about your electoral prospects. I mean, the man who created J.D. Vance as a political figure out of whole cloth and gave him all his jobs and also his seat in the U.S. Senate and also his introduction to Trump, he says he does not believe freedom is compatible with democracy. He wants freedom, so that means he does not want democracy. If you are Donald Trump and the Republican Party and you are worried about your ability to win this election in November, you would not pick J.D. Vance as your vice presidential candidate. You can only pick a candidate as out there as J.D. Vance if you're really thoroughly quite sure that you're going to win no matter what kind of craziness you put on the ticket and what you're going to bring into the White House with you. J.D. Vance is not the guy you pick to win over suburban women or whatever. He's not the persuade the undecideds guy. J.D. Vance is the guy you bring in to change the American system of government into whatever it is you think comes after us being a republic. And you only do that because you already think you have the election in the bag. What is coming together on both sides of the political spectrum right now is that Republicans who are thrilled to have it in the bag think they have it in the bag. And that's why tonight isn't Nikki Haley giving her acceptance speech. It's not, even Tim Scott or Marco Rubio. It is national abortion ban, end of the republic, J.D. Vance, who was giving the speech tonight. On the Democratic side, this very serious reported turn related to President Biden's prospects of staying at the top of the ticket in this race. These reported visits to the president from the top Democrats in Congress. What is the reporting about this? They're not just going to him and expressing their opinion. They're going to him and they're bringing him the polling. And it is not about the Republicans' hopes and expectations that they have it in the bag. It is about the Democrats' fear that the Republicans might be right, and that, therefore, a radical change might be necessary to avert what Democrats fear is an otherwise inevitable course. It is J.D. Vance night at the Republican National Convention, and to have that happening at the same time that this reporting is now surfacing about President Biden is as serious as a heart attack on both sides. While we have been talking, we have a little bit of new information. We have a response from the White House. The president, this is from a White House spokesperson. The president told both leaders, meaning Schumer and Jeffries, he is the nominee of the party. He plans to win and looks forward to working with both of them to pass his 100 days agenda to help working families. So this is obviously the top line response here is, no, I'm not going anywhere. But this also, I think implicitly, I may be a little over my skis here, but I think this implicitly confirms that Schumer and Jeffries did go to President Biden and say, we're going to lose with you at the top of the ticket, and therefore you need to decide if those are, if you want that to be your legacy.
Well, unless Schumer and Jeffries deny that that's what they said,
and
even though we don't have
details,
and neither of them have issued something, which Nicole and I have written a lot of statements. We've been a part of a lot of non-denial denials. So if that's not true, they should come out and say it's not true. I just want to echo something Nicole said, because I think a lot of Democrats have been under a great deal of attack, online and otherwise. And the reason that people are having this conversation is because of the threat of Donald Trump and now J.D. Vance, who will read the Project 2025 plan and be a more effective implementer. It's not because they don't like Joe Biden. It's not because they don't think he was a great president. It's because they're scared that they could take over and what they would do to our country. That's why people are having the conversation. But in terms of what we know and what we don't know, which is always important too, I will say that contextually, having worked for Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries are people that are obviously leaders in the Democratic Party. They're not people he has close personal relationships with, as close as he has with, say, Jim Clyburn, or close as he has with Nancy Pelosi. There have been reports, and again, we're all piecing together reports and talking to a lot of people about Pelosi's behind-the-scenes work. We don't know much more about that. Obviously, I think it's hard to believe that Adam Schiff would have done what he did without her knowing about it, but a spokesperson for her said it was news to her. Again, these are just things we know right now. The other things we don't know is the impact on money. If the money dries up, that's obviously a huge factor. But I think the last thing I will just say about what to know about Joe Biden, because it's what's the reality here we're watching, and also how he operates as a human, is that he has felt underestimated. Always. He's got a chip on his shoulder.
It's his superpower. It always has been.
Superpower. He feels that people never thought he could win in 2020, and he didn't. These are entirely different circumstances. But for anyone who's thinking, well, the leaders of the Democratic Party are telling him he should step out, it's over in a matter of hours, I just wouldn't make a bet on that.
Yeah. Joy.
What I will say is that what you reported, and very well set up, matches what I am hearing from. I feel like I, at this point, might have talked to every single member of the Congressional Black Caucus in the last, 24 to 48 hours. It matches what I am hearing, not just from them, but from some of the people whose job it will be to turn out votes. I mean, there are people who actually do this. They are people who specialize in turning out, particularly votes in places like Fulton County, places like Detroit, places like Milwaukee that Democrats will have to win. And win big and get big turnout in order to win the election. And what I am hearing and the anger that I'm hearing that's coming from them is that, to the point that you were making, given the stakes, and the stakes being democracy itself, the stakes being Project 2025, the stakes being a Trump presidency, which I think everyone agrees African Americans would be first in line to suffer, right? And so they understand the stakes, that there is a sense among the people that I have spoken to, including some senior members of that caucus, that given that, there is a sense that there is gamesmanship going on inside of this effort to remove President Biden from the ticket, and that gamesmanship is heavily geared toward also pushing aside Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris. And there is a sense that there is a lot of pressure coming from there. Some people are just calling it California at this point, whether it's donors or whether it is members, whether it is whoever. This sense of huge pressure for the CBC, which is locked arms with President Biden. I think we can all agree on that. Sure. They have been unwavering. They are sticking with him. Claire McCaskill will tell you to the very end. They are with him. that the huge pressure is coming without regard to the vice president, and that there is this, what they perceive is a push for an open convention, and that people are taking the risk of playing 2028 games with a 2024 crisis. And that the gamesmanship in trying to maneuver people who may want to run in 2028 and maneuver them in now is seen as undercutting the whole project, when the project is beating Trump. What a lot of folks are telling me is that they see gamesmanship to try to set aside the person who would be next in line in 2028, meaning the vice president. That they will, and I'll just say my last thing is that what I will tell you is just based on the many dozens of conversations. I feel like I haven't been off the phone and I am exhausted by it.
But I am willing to Joy was literally on the phone until the second.
I was literally still responding
to text. You have that little strap on your phone? I thought you had a landline. I was like, oh my God, we brought in a landline.
It's my tether. I literally wear the phone around my neck because I always lose my phone. And if I don't literally have it hanging on my neck,
I thought you were like on a hotline to Moscow or something. I was like, oh no. Sure.
Jason Mark Anthony Reed, my wonderful husband, finally realized that I will never stop asking where my phone is until I literally can wear it like an ornament. So it's a necklace. This is when you have a good partner in life. So this is the tether. But yes, and I was literally listening to you and responding. And that is the sense that people fear that Vice President Harris will be moved aside in this process, and the CBC will not move. Hakeem Jeffries is an exception because obviously he represents the whole caucus. They ain't going nowhere as long as they think that she's in jeopardy.
Okay, but what if Vice President Harris isn't in jeopardy?
Yeah.
And what if the move relates to President Biden, but is about elevating President Harris? It's
totally different conversation. And I had a very senior member of the CBC say that to me almost verbatim, that if this was a conversation, they would obviously all support her. I mean, she's a member. She was a member of the CBC when she was in the United States Senate. They adore her. They love him. I mean, let's just be, I think you said it maybe. President Biden is beloved in the party. Like, that is just very clear. Even the people who are asking him to move aside, they love the guy. And they've been hugely successful as Democrats
under him. All his political rivals love him.
They love
everybody who's ever fought with him.
Some Republicans who won't admit it love him too.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I think that is there's a sense, don't play this game with this important issue.
And I would just say in 2 sentences, everything you just said can be true. And the closer you get to the convention, the more that logistically the only off-ramp would be the vice president, because you wouldn't have time for an open convention.
Right.
You wouldn't logistically and financially, legally be able to do much with the campaign coffers unless they were part of the Biden-Harris ticket. So what you described could be a now thing. We don't know, as Rachel emphasized, where this reporting goes. But if this is still being discussed 2 weeks from now, it starts to narrow from only Biden, which is what he's reiterated tonight, or perhaps his running mate who can take over the campaign infrastructure and financing, not starting from scratch in late August.
The idea of, they keep telling me we have to take a break. I'm sorry, to the control room. This is a very important conversation. And I need to talk to my people. I will pay personally or do a GoFundMe or something. Whatever commercial we're missing right now. I'm very sorry. I just have to finish this conversation. Forgive me. I will say that I don't do a lot of this. I'm not like a person who has tons and tons of live sources in politics because I don't like being friends with people who I cover. And so I don't like people having my phone number.
It's wise.
Well, once you like people, it makes it hard to cover them with the grit you need. I'm just I'm too suburban. I can't do it. So I don't do this a lot. But this is an exception. I'm having one of these moments where I, too, am talking and texting with senators and members of Congress all day. And I have to say, just reacting to what you're hearing, Joy, what I am hearing, and maybe we're talking to some of the same people, I don't know, but if Vice President Harris were going to be the choice of the Democratic Party, if President Biden decided, you know what, for whatever reason and on whatever terms, I'm going to pass the torch. I'm going to be a transitional leader now. Yeah. And it was going to go to Vice President Harris. There would definitely be a lot of work to do to make sure that Vice President Harris was strongly positioned to beat Donald Trump in November. But it would then be a normal Democratic work project to get her to try to win. There wouldn't be this existential thing going on.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I know we're in trouble as long as we're already in trouble. I'll add my reporting. It was described to me today as dynamic, not static, because Vice President Kamala Harris's political strength is a moving and ascending part of the story as well. Yeah. And there was a sense 2 weeks ago that there was a question mark around her electability. There was a report last week that there's a poll in the field by the president's own polling allies testing that her political strength without any ads, without any effort behind it, is very impressive. A lot of political people in both parties would love to design a campaign around Vice President Kamala Harris. A lot of her speeches have been happening in my hours. I've been taking them live. And I've said this, but she's electric on the campaign trail. And he picked her. And he gave an unbelievable speech yesterday. And his first line was, "Do you know what a black job is?"
That's a good line.
A black job is Vice President of the United States. And whatever he decides, it's a fantastic argument to take to the country. It's a phenomenal contrast with Donald Trump. And I guess the other side to what you sort of laid on the table, which is so sobering, is there's so much baseball left to play. It's like the second inning of one of 7 18-inning games. And the 18 innings is the longest game ever played. I mean, there's so much left. And there's the Democrats, who I think are all acting in good faith. They don't need any advice from me. But the only thing I would say is there's no room for despair. There's a lot of time. She's fantastic. He's beloved. And everything will probably be okay.
God bless you.
We love that. I know we're already in trouble. I want to add one more thing. I also think that the president will be influenced by seeing her own path to victory. I mean, this is obviously a decision he has to make. It's frustrating people on many levels. People are angry, they're upset, they're mad. But he cares deeply about the Democratic Party. He cares deeply about the Senate winning, about the House being in Democratic control. And if he can see a path for her to victory, I have no doubt that would be influential for him, too. And while he picked her, I did think what he said about her the last couple of days is true and also significant, and people should hear that. But that's another piece. But I will give one piece of advice to the Democrats out there. People who are supporters of her who don't know where this is going to end. Far too many people are in stories saying, don't take this away from her, which, by the way, is incredibly defensive about someone who's an electric performer on the campaign trail who speaks about abortion rights in a completely compelling way. There's no reason to be defensive. Whatever happens, she's a powerful, amazing candidate who'd be a great candidate and a great president, period. That's what people should be saying. It's way too defensive of a conversation. The only person who makes the decision is Joe Biden. But there's no reason to disparage her being, that only conversation being about her being passed over.
And by the way, I think we're going to have to send a Venmo to MSNBC to pay for all this.
We'll all contribute.
And I will say the last thing that I did have someone say to me, which I thought was a quite compelling argument, who obviously is a big supporter of hers. Imagine the prospect of a former sex crimes prosecutor prosecuting a 34-count felon who's also been an adjudicated sexual assaulter. And I think for a lot of people, that just the idea of just watching that match happen is kind of giving people a little bit of the feels, the excitement.
I will also say, I have two things to say. One is that there was a poll out today, a poll of African-American women showing a 31-point drop in support from 2020 to 2024 in terms of plans to vote for President Biden. Vice President Harris turned that around. And if you think Democrats can win the presidency with a 30-point drop in the black female vote, there's a real problem at hand. And if Vice President Harris has the support of President Biden and the support of the party broadly, and can get there procedurally, I think there isn't a brighter path in November than the path that goes through her. And we shall see. The other thing I have to tell you is that we killed a break. And,
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.